quickly, I'm Director of Fellowships and Networks at the Centre for Science and Policy at University of Cambridge, and for UPEN, I co-lead our work on areas of research interest and similar types of schemes which bring policy questions to the academic audience. It's going to be my pleasure to chair today. I'm going to make a few housekeeping announcements. So the session today is being recorded. We know some people wished to attend and weren't able to do this, so it's going to be made available on the UPEN website afterwards. That does include the question and answer session. If you have questions as the presenters are speaking, please enter them in the chat, and then I might ask some of you to come on video and mic at the point we come to the Q&A and voice those questions, or I can read them out, especially for any connection issues. So do be aware of that, that this is being recorded. The presenters are happy to share the slides afterwards, so those are going to be made available to you. Yeah, please keep your mic off. I think that may have automatically happened while the speakers are presenting, and then we'll get into a more interactive session halfway through. So I'll say a few words about UPEN for those of you who this might be your first time attending a UPEN event, and I'll make some introductions to the panel. So the University's Policy Engagement Network is a UK-wide network which exists to join 100+ universities and HEIs and research organisations up in the work that we want to do in helping researchers connect with policy and analytical communities in civil and public service roles. And we do this through a knowledge mobilisation type of network. So many of the institutional leads at different universities might be in a particular policy unit, and through them we like to cascade to reach as many academics as possible. I'll remind you at the end, again, we do a fortnightly, very useful bulletin email newsletter that comes out with engagement opportunities and events and resources for the sector. We have an events page on the UPEN website, and we hope that you might be interested in looking to us to help with ideas and connections for your impact plans if you're a researcher. So to introduce today's event, we were very pleased to be approached by the Ombudsman Association with their interest in their members being more connected with the academic community in the UK and showcasing some of the opportunities. So it's going to be our pleasure to initially have Dónal speak to us, Dónal Galligan, the Chief Executive of the Ombudsman Association. Then we're going to turn on to a particular and large and significant ombudsman, the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, with Michael Hyatt, Professional Practice Lead, speaking about their role. And then we have Han Wang, who's joining us as a lecturer in economic geography at University of Southampton, who has specific experience of carrying out research and publishing paper as a result of his work with the Ombudsman concerned. So my first role will be to pass on to Dónal, who's going to give an introduction of this sector, and please do think of questions and start entering them in the chat as you listen to Dónal.
Thanks very much, Nikki. Yes, so what I'm going to do is give a little bit of an overview of the OA itself and the Ombudsman landscape, explain the role of an Ombudsman and the insights that they hold. So first of all, a little bit about us. We cover, as this slide shows, we cover all public and private sector ombudsman schemes and major complaint handling bodies in the 4 nations of the UK, the Republic of Ireland, the British Crown dependencies and the British overseas territories spread around the world. That means that we've got 33 ombudsman members across those 11 different nations and territories. And within that geographical coverage, we set the criteria for how an ombudsman should be set up, their governance and what they should be doing. And that criteria is recognised by the UK government as best practice through 2 different streams, one being the guidance from Cabinet Office to government departments on setting up an ombudsman scheme, and the other being that at Companies House, ombudsman is a sensitive term, and that means that a business operating in the UK can only use the term if they meet our criteria. On to the next slide. As I think probably you know on this call, ombudsman schemes are an alternative to the courts. They're an independent redress model, free at the point of use for citizens and consumers, that can drive systemic change, tackle injustice, and help organisations, whether they're public or private, to perform more efficiently and effectively. In terms of the UK, we've got 22 Ombudsman members and 17 complaint handler members. I won't get into the detail about the complaint handler members now, but just to say that they're organisations that also work in that complaints landscape. And as you can see from this slide, between those members, we cover both public services and those in the private and consumer sector. And it will include ombudsman schemes that are statutory and compulsory for all providers in that sector, and also schemes that are voluntary for the sector in question. So you can see from this long list that that covers complaints about everything from the NHS to energy companies, financial services, legal services, broadband, care homes, fitted kitchens, trains, housing, on and on. But if we go on to the next slide, what I wanted to highlight with this kind of slightly fancy quote about complaints being a window into the soul of an organisation is because how complaints are dealt with can reveal the true culture in an organisation, not the stated one. And they can provide an early warning system on potential systemic processes or design failures. Ombudsman schemes, which were recently described by the Master of the Rolls as the unsung heroes of the justice system, which was very kind of him to say, do offer more than just that basic transactional complaint handling, which simply picks a winner in a dispute. Resolving an individual dispute is, of course, key to those individuals involved, but the real value in the Ombudsman model is their role in feeding back the lessons learned from their work in order to help secure redress for others in a similar situation, and also to improve service delivery and complaints management for the future. And this is all based on what is fair and reasonable. And for that reason, Ombudsman is sometimes described as being more like a doctor than a police officer, diagnosing what's wrong and making recommendations to improve. And it's in that guise, as a sort of agent of change, that they can play a role in rebuilding trust and public and consumer confidence. Each of those 22 ombudsman schemes that I'm highlighting are valuable intelligence generating organisations. As a result of them collectively dealing with over 1 million complaints each year, they have a treasure trove of thousands of lived experiences of people's problems with a range of public services and private sector organisations. But unfortunately, due to capacity and resource constraints, ombudsman schemes can often struggle to measure the impact their work is having and the difference that they make more broadly. And that's why, as Michael is going to go on to explain more, LGSCO have looked to collaborate with researchers. So I will now hand over to Michael.
Thanks, Dónal. Brilliant. That set me up really nicely. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about what we at the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, have done in recent years to try and strengthen our relationship with research institutions, and to talk very briefly about two worked examples. So just a very quick bit of background. Who are we? What do we cover? As our name suggests, we cover local government and social care, but specifically English local government and social care. We've been around since 1974, so we're over 50 years old, almost my age. We cover all English councils. We also cover some other public bodies like national parks, fire authorities, etc., that were related to local government in the past. And crucially, as well as those public service organisations, we also have a private sector relationship with privately commissioned social care. So if you arrange social care yourself, you pay for it yourself, we can investigate complaints about that. And as I say at the bottom there, it's kind of, as Dónal said, all human life, it seems, sometimes passes through our complaint handling, everything from bins to benefits, special educational needs to streetlights, the full panoply of local government and local public services. And crucially, we also work collaboratively with some of our other public service ombudsman colleagues, particularly the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman and the Housing Ombudsman Service. And we can carry out joint inspections. And those joint investigations, those are really reflective of the reality of people's lives, that, you know, institutional boundaries and demarcations don't reflect how people actually live. So as far as the legislation allows, we try and work collaboratively and we carry out joint investigations. Next slide, please. So what do we do? Essentially, like most, certainly the Ombudsman schemes that Dónal's talked about, we all sort of follow similar processes, but essentially at its core, what we do is we look at what should have happened, what legislation, what guidance, what good practice, what sound administrative practice says should have happened. We look at what did happen, and we look at whether there's been fault, and if that has happened, has that caused an injustice to the individual? And where it has caused injustice to the individual, we look at what needs to be done to put things right for that individual. But crucially for this audience, we also make more and more what we call service improvement recommendations, which are essentially recommendations back to the organisation, to the council in particular, or to the care provider, to say, you've got something systemically wrong here that could affect and is affecting many other people. So, for example, you know, we've investigated in the past where councils awarding allowances for special guardians, adults looking after children that are not their relations, have been calculated wrongly. It sounds very technical, very procedural, but it had a real impact on their lives. So we made recommendations for things to be put right that's changed the lives of thousands of people as a consequence. Crucially, again, for this audience, we publish almost all, that's like 98% or thereabouts of our decisions online. They're anonymized, they're searchable, and increasingly AI searchable. So you can ask questions, you can look at that rich panoply of evidence, and actually we think it's great free research resource, according to researchers who have used it, and Han will talk a little bit about that shortly. Next slide, please. So as Dónal's already used the cliche, thousands of lived experience decisions every year we make, many of which have key lessons, many of which are around changing the way local authorities work. We also publish wider lessons learned focus reports, but as Dónal very succinctly said, we are very limited in our ability to look beyond asking, has the organisation done what we asked it to? Crucially, we can't tell organisations to do things, we can ask them, but almost all the time our arguments are so persuasive and so compelling and so grounded in sense, evidence, etc., that organisations do what we say. But we can check that they've done what they said they would, but we have no resource to look at the long-term consequences, the long-term impact. Did this make a difference? And that's we think where research institutions can play a really key role, and it's a sort of symbiotic, potentially a symbiotic relationship there. We are, as I say, data rich, but intelligence poor. That's not to say we lack intelligence, but we lack the capacity to really dig into that intelligence, and we don't know what difference we make. And I think that's becoming more and more important for us, because when we were created in 1974, I think we were created very much in the context of putting individual mistakes right. But now, as we all know, we're operating in a public sector environment where there are lots of broken or on the edge of being broken systems where change needs to be much more fundamental. Next slide, please. So a couple of worked examples to go through. Firstly, Han will talk about this in more detail, but in the last few years, been working with the Blavatnik Institute at Oxford. They did this really intense, really quantitative research into the difference we make in our adult social care decisions. What were the immediate, what were the long-term effects? What was the impact of our decisions on those councils' performance, those councils' behaviour? And actually, you know, in terms of social sciences, having a control group, having a really robust evidence base to say, what's the difference between when we got involved and where we haven't got involved? What's the tangible outcome, the quantifiable outcome, and test our intervention? And the key findings from that for us were a really strong positive correlation between our reports and reduced maladministration, that's our term, our legal term, and control, and that we were really effective, remarkably effective, I think was the quote, at regulation inside government even though we don't have those powers to compel. So it's really valuable for us. It's really important for us. It did point to areas where we could do things differently, but it crucially validated. Next slide, please. This is some research which is ongoing at the moment with the University of Manchester Law School, Nuffield Institute funded, and it couldn't be more timely this week because it is looking at special educational needs. And as you'll all be aware, there's been a major policy statement on that from government. But it's really been asking that question of, in the context of such a challenged, arguably broken system, are our investigations, are our recommendations really capable of making a difference? And the early conclusions are that we are having real impact in spite of all of that turbulence and change, particularly as a leverage for influencing local leaders making a difference. Next slide, please. So how would we like to work with you? Well, what we've done is try to coordinate our engagement with higher education and research institutions much better now than ever been in the past. We have a coordinated approach. I work to spot either proactive reaching out from HEIs to us, or also to try and identify potential areas of research interest for us, things that we would love to have answered by research if only we had the resources. And we can work with those organisations we identify there's a mutual benefit from to support bids for funding, to really put our weight behind it and emphasise the practical impact of research on us as an organisation. We obviously triage even research proposals to focus on those that make most difference to us. We signpost to help where we can. We signpost to the free resources that we have available. But in cases like Blavatnik, like working with Han and his colleagues, we really put an intensive effort into supporting them, including seconding Han into our organisation for a period of time so that he could get inside the data. But I know he's going to talk about that in more detail when he speaks. So that's all from me, I think. Brilliant.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So, hello, this is Han. So from my part, I'm going to share an insider research perspective on working with local government and social care ombudsman. So I will explain how collaboration started and how we built from the initial data request to a much deeper collaboration through a fellowship. And I will also share what I think about other universities and learn from our collaboration experience. So this work began when I was a postdoc at Oxford University in 2022. So I was working with my collaborator, also my line manager at Brown School of Government at the time. So we were researching the local government reform, especially the intermunicipal collaboration. Sometimes we call it shared service in UK. So we want to understand whether reforms can affect the quality of the public service in England. So from the research perspective, so the complaints data from the Ombudsman is a very powerful lens. So it captures the service problems that matter to our real people. So it often reflects the organization process, such as delays, communication failures, or you can say the poor decision making. But our challenge with that, the public data available online at the time on the Ombudsman website did not fully match our needs, because we need a relatively long time period and we need more granular information in the specific policy areas. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then we just reached out to Mike. So at the LGSCO. So we were very honest. So we explained our research question and why Ombudsman perspective could be very useful, and what we could contribute as researchers. So Mike was genuinely interested in, and the initial collaboration was very practical and efficient, and Mike shared data we need. We were able to access for that specific research that allowed us to explore the patterns over time. So we also capture interaction active. So we shared very early descriptive results and ask some questions and check whether we were interpreting the data and empirical findings correctly. So even at the early stage, you can see that this kind of partnership is really like the two-way direction. So it's we're not only receiving the data, but we just try to sharing our insights and learning more stuff from the Ombudsman. So next slide, please. So I would say the big turning point with the Oxford HERF engagement fellowship. I guess a lot of other universities had this kind of fellowship. So by that time, so we had quite enough early interaction to show the credibility and the relevance. So the local government ombudsman agreed to become an official partner and might provide a very strong reference letter for this. So fortunately, we won the fellowship. So winning that grant indeed changed the depth of the engagement. So it created a very structured time and a very clear framework. So in this way, we could plan activities for more interesting research questions and try to improve the data set we have and build a more shared understanding of the research and the public value. So that was still, sorry, yeah. So that was to the very end of the COVID. So we had quite limits on the on-site work, but the fellowship enabled us to have a very close form of the collaboration. So yeah, so next slide, please. Thanks. So specifically, there are two kinds of access. The first is the data access. So not just the data set, but clarity about definition, changes over time, and what the variable truly capture. And second is process access. So, the tacit knowledge that researchers often miss. So such as how investigations work and how some cases escalate. So this really matters because it reduces a lot of risk of the misunderstanding or misinterpretation when we have the results. So it can also make our research more credible. So yeah, another thing I probably want to stress is our colleagues, our local government ombudsman colleagues were very supportive, but they didn't try to steal the results. So the combination, the openness plus the respect from the research independence is really good standard for the research partnerships. So the next one, please. Thank you. So just one slide about our research output. So based on this partnerships, we published a paper in the J part. So in this paper, we ask whether accountability to an external body can trigger the turnarounds in the struggling public service. So we studied the public interest notification in adult social care. So we used some causal methods such as matching and the stack death and find a larger reduction in the maladministration after notification. So we also see some behavior responses that fits the turnaround story, such as the leadership tension increases and the internal control efforts rise. So the final slides, please. Thank you. So let me just end with some lessons and a forward-looking message. So for other universities, I guess the first lesson is to start with the public value story. So if the first email looks like the pure data extraction, it is really hard to build a trust. So you probably need to explain the problem, what it matters, and how research can contribute to learning. So that would be very important. The second would be the partnership work best with a shared workflow. So you probably need to use some plain language and share definition, and also quick feedback loops can always help. So in terms of the scaling, so I would say the small seed funding such as the HERF style engagement fellows can always be very helpful. So it can create a time and a structure. It can also turn an informal relationship into the partnership with a shared expectation. So overall, I think the outlook is very positive. The Ombudsman data can support the learning across the very different public service at the local government level. So it also has a very strong place dimension. So when you can see patterns across different areas, it becomes much easier to think about the area targeted improvement and also something like the spatial equality reduction. So hopefully more universities can see this is a very constructive area in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Han. So I guess the real question that many of you will be asking is, well, why now? Why would this be of any interest, or why would the right time to kind of strike the iron as such? I think most people would probably agree that people's rights have never mattered more than they seem to in the last couple of years. The UK Department of Business and Trade's Consumer Detriment Survey showed that 7 in 10 UK consumers had a negative experience with an item or service, and they believe that the total cost of consumer detriment in the UK is estimated to be £71.2 billion, which is a crazy number to begin with, but that's up from the estimated £54 billion in 2021. At the same time, the Ministry of Justice's most recent legal problem resolution survey showed that certain groups of the population are far more likely to experience problems than others, and you won't be surprised by the groups that they highlighted. People from ethnic minority backgrounds, adults with long-term health conditions, those on means-tested benefits, and single parents. And of course, Citizens Advice have a whole webinar series on the ongoing impact that the cost of living crisis is still having on working people. That perhaps partly explains why our members are seeing increasing year-on-year demand, and that's across the entire Ombudsman sector. There's a few figures thrown in there. Of course, it depends where do you measure it at. Are you talking about at the very front end and the kind of contacts that you have there, or is it about full investigations? But some of those figures are enough to certainly scare us. The Communications Ombudsman up 54%, Housing Ombudsman and Motor Ombudsman both up 42%, Scottish Public Service Ombudsman up 39%. As I say, I've picked these, but I could have picked others instead. It's kind of across the board. And it does feel like the policy history in the UK has frequently been that the victims of injustice have often struggled to have their voice heard until a scandal, tragedy, or major failing occurs, and that after it does, the creation of an ombudsman or the expansion of an existing one is regularly part of the government of the day's preferred policy solution. We can see that most recently in the proposals to create an ombudsman for the water industry and also one for the private rented sector. And yet, at the same time, we've recently had the Treasury review of the Financial Ombudsman Service, which has questioned the value of the Ombudsman, of that fair and reasonable approach, claiming that it creates uncertainty for businesses and so constrains economic growth. So there's clearly a need for greater understanding of the impact that Ombudsman schemes have. The Ethics and Integrity Commission, which is the successor body to the Committee on Standards in Public Life, they have announced that their next report, or their next review, I should say, is going to be looking at public sector ombudsman. This follows from the report from their previous body that looked at recognising and responding to early warning signs in public sector bodies and really questioned the value of public inquiries, both the cost and effectiveness in trying to drive change. And they've said that their first review is going to look at whether ombudsman schemes in the public sector should play a greater role in investigating systemic issues before they escalate and kind of supporting public bodies to investigate swift and meaningful improvements. We're expecting more information on that in March, and I think that might actually mean next week, so kind of watch out for that. So really what we think that means is that the services that ombudsman schemes provide are in unprecedented demand. The data they hold and the insight they provide is unique, and it's regularly seen as essential by governments seeking to address systemic issues and drive change. And yet, at the same time, there is uncertainty over how much impact ombudsman schemes do have, and this is all at a time when organisations are expected to justify their existence and value for money, as we've heard. So we think this provides a great opportunity for researchers to tackle those questions that really matter for citizens and to help drive improvements. And the point we're trying to get across is the sector is keen to engage. I know some of my colleagues are also on the call today, but we as an association, we have research and policy networks that draw together all of our members. And I'm very happy to act as a facilitator for anyone interested to put you in touch with one of our members. The next slide just shows some contact details. Don't worry, you don't have to scribble them down. And of course, we couldn't help but try and promote the things that we do on social media as well. But these slides are going to be shared. And the very next slide is just a silly little picture to hopefully make you smile before I hand back to Nikki.
Thanks very much. I love this cartoon. That's great, Dónal. I hope that's been a really good overview for you all of the ombudsman sector in the UK and some of the opportunities. I'll start off the questions, and then please do make a note in the chat if you'd like to come in or raise your hand. So I was going to ask about the process of getting a fellowship set up, Han, and kind of what timescale you were able to do that over. So when you asked to sort of identified you might become more embedded, did you have to I mean, I assume that it involved all these processes of kind of understanding how you would get access to data, the actual sign in and logins and maybe physical presence you would have with local government and social care ombudsman. How long did it take to get that set up, and then how long did you spend in that role and then writing up?
Yeah, so I would say it's quite so as soon as you get the fellowship, so everything is quite efficient. So the fellowship scheme was quite short, so that is only for nine month period. So at that time we just need to speed up. So because as I mentioned, it is the time of the COVID, so it is impossible for me to go on site. So Ombudsman just sent me the laptop, and in this way I can access to the data. So we spent around, I think, 3 or 4 months to access all the data we need and started to do the analysis. And so then we started to think about, so based on the data, based on the reports we wrote, and also the report we read. So then we started to think what would be the research question we were truly interested in. And then we spent another probably half a year to negotiate, to discuss the research question, to see whether this kind of the research design will be plausible for our research. Yeah.
Mm. And I guess this is a question that goes to academics all the time, is are you being asked to demonstrate the impact of your research as well? Like, so where's your coming up to the Research Excellence Framework or other reporting? Have you been asked, you publish this paper, which has been useful for local government and social care ombudsman, but have you been asked or have you been thinking any more about how you also take part in the dissemination and whether there's learning from your paper that could be relevant more widely, or in a sense, have you passed that back to local government social care ombudsman and the Ombudsman Association to think about how this could have impact elsewhere?
Yeah, exactly. So in the paper, the way we make the narrative is just to try to describe it as something like the low stakes accountability. And so I think that can be quite common even for the UK or for the worldwide scenario. So that is the way how to interpret Ombudsman reports. So so for future research, I think because for only this research, we only focus on the adult social care. So there are other kind of care we probably can explore. So in this way, we can discuss something more external validity, something like the social the children cares inside this. So probably if other research interested in, so that would be also other areas you can dive in the future.
Yeah, Mike wants to come in.
No, I was just going to say, firstly, I hope we made it as simple as possible for Han and the project to be supported, and certainly that seems to have been the case. I think what I would say to maybe, they might not be on the call, but my colleagues, is just don't underestimate the timescales. So for us, the research was immensely valuable, but it took a very long time. And I think we learned a lot about the whole process of research that we just didn't know, particularly peer review and the time peer review takes, and actually going through the publication process. So I guess for academics and research institutions in the call, it might be worth you being gentle with the Ombudsman scheme that you're engaged with, and taking them through that right at the outset, just as Thomas and Han did very well right at the outset, because we're kind of used to, kind of doing a bit of research and getting the results back in a couple of months. And this was like several years in gestation, but it was well worth the wait.
Thank you. That's a useful perspective. And we hear that sometimes in this area of academic and policy collaborations, is there are things, if you need to procure quickly, that you might do in different ways, but the robustness of the academic research process and being realistic about the timescale for that. Yeah, Claire, you want to come in?
Yeah, so I have a question that maybe is for Dónal, which is about, I suppose, the range of ombudsman schemes, and potentially we've talked about capacity of where ombudsman schemes do have capacity, where they don't. But I get a sense that also the scale of different ombudsmen are also quite different potentially, and whether there is something to be aware of in terms of whether there are some that might be more able to sort of engage or more interested in doing this kind of work than others.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yeah, it's our membership is very diverse, not just in the sense of the nations we cover and those sectors, but you're right about the size as well. You've got the Financial Ombudsman Service, which is the biggest ombudsman in the world. You can almost see it from space. You know, depending on the day of the week, they've got about a £300 million budget and 3,500 staff. That goes right down to the Waterways Ombudsman, which deals with complaints about the Canal and Rivers Trust, is one person working part-time on a budget of 40,000. Now, the majority of our members are around the similar size to LGSCO. So that's, you know, the legal ombudsman, the other public service ombudsman as well. And so we'll more than likely have some kind of research budget. This feels like a slopey shoulders politician style answer, but it really does depend, because it's as Mike was already saying, they're potentially going to be looking at other things and they're going to be assessing things that come forward. They might have utilized their budget already for that year, or they might be able to tap into other funds. So in the sense, what I'd say is broadly members are all ombudsman schemes are keen to engage because they want that insight. Absolutely, it's about managing those expectations. You know, this isn't, I think we're not necessarily talking about this kind of like quick journalistic style returns. We're talking about something that is robust and therefore carries more weight and is worth the additional time and effort put in. So what I would try and encourage your colleagues on this call and others to do is to reach out to begin with and to see what opportunities there are, because I think our members are very eager to get that support and that insight. Then you have to have the practical questions about, okay, well, what could we make work and what resources could be made available? That was a very generic response.
That's great. Thank you for giving us an idea of the scale, which it can be so different. And thanks for the conversation that's going on in the chat. So Mike has helpfully answered about integrated care boards and two of the ombudsman, both LGCSO and the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. I don't know if Sarah wanted to put her camera on and just say a little bit about what your research concerns. It'd be interesting to hear if you can join us. Because it's interesting that Sarah is researching internal processes and governance of the integrated care boards. Can't unmute.
Just if I could, I just say something on that one, Nicola, if that's okay. I mean, just a point that might be of interest to others is, I can see Sarah's interest is in internal processes and governance. We certainly, like most, as far as I know, on other ombudsman schemes, our focus is very much on investigating complaints about injustice caused by fault to individuals or groups of individuals. So what we don't do as an ombudsman service is kind of take a step back and kind of look at a general review of governance or issues, wider governance issues, unless those feature in an organizational investigation that we're doing. We don't have sort of roving powers to go looking for stuff, but we certainly are interested in that, and certainly PHSO is. So yeah, I can.
Great. I don't know if Sarah, if you'd like to come in, and would that angle of going in via complaints be of interest to you?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I was kind of wondering how deep into the organisation the ombudsman would go. So if obviously, if it's starting from the perspective of an individual complaint, but presumably if that's then related to the workings and the kind of decision-making processes that happen within the ICB, then, that would be a really useful thing to do. I might just get in touch with them and see if there's anything that we can do together. Sounds good. Thank you.
Great. I was going to ask, it's kind of an intriguing title, and I understand why you must have chosen it, Han, that you chose low stakes accountability in your academic paper, and understanding from Dónal that, you know, while the Ombudsman is set up to provide these individual redress and to look at these individual complaints, you know, you're not set up with the same powers as in exactly the same way as a kind of regulator and other regulators. But in some ways, you think there's high stakes accountability. I mean, how I wanted to invite the speakers to talk about this is that you have got some areas of kind of publicity and these kind of, there's obviously enough knowledge of these schemes that people are coming to them, and if you've got that increase in volume. But do you think, would you like to say to the academics on the call, we're talking about both low stakes and high stakes accountability? Who wants to come in on that?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I'll start.
Yeah.
Shall I start? So, I mean, yeah, I think we struggled slightly with the term low stakes because we felt mildly kind of, not insulted would be a strong word. It's like, who are you calling low stakes? But then we understood it and we were fine with it. I think it was a comparison with the likes of Ofsted, for example, as an inspectorate that, you know, has that very, very high profile. You know, if you don't get the outstanding rating, it has real consequences, immediate consequences for people's jobs, etc. Whereas we have typically worked, you know, our legislative environment is working in a context where we can make recommendations, and we have powers to require reports, to require publication of reports, etc. But ultimately, we don't have a lever that we can pull that will make an organisation do things differently. But nevertheless, you know, almost all the time we can and do affect changes, as Han's report hopefully shows. But I think it was interesting. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Han, but I think you found it interesting, and Blatning found it interesting to look at the role ombudsman schemes like ours play with the levers we do have versus the more higher profile areas of regulatory activity that have influence in very different ways, and that actually there might be some strengths, some differences in approach that ombudsman schemes operate. But as Dónal will probably say, in different ombudsmen have different powers, different abilities, different leverage. So yeah.
Han, did you want to come in next, or shall I go? I'll go then.
Yeah, I just think, yeah, I might just answer almost just to say what I want to say. But most of the time, so the simple way we think about this is just to think about the punishment. So for the high stakes ones, we always think like the punishment will be very high, but the low stakes one. So sometimes people think that the low stake one won't be so as useful as the high one. But so you can see that in our paper there sometimes, so even you get people kind of the signal, so you can also get, so just to receive the really good benefit in the end.
And Dónal, did you come in?
Yeah, I think I just want to say that Mike's touched on this a little bit as well, but the things that are often complained about, I think quite often seem like, you know, low stakes. It is the fact that the bins haven't been collected, or that, you know, a doctor was rude or refused to apologize, and other things which can seem really small and maybe even a little bit petty. Once you get into them, you know, the bins crisis in Birmingham showed that the organization was, I know they can't go bankrupt, but had effectively gone bankrupt. If you've got a culture in a hospital or an NHS provider where senior leaders refuse to apologize for things, I think that suggests that there's maybe something fundamentally wrong here, which sadly we have seen with major inquiries. So I think that's one of the things about ombudsman schemes, you know, maladministration, injustice, which I know is mentioned there. Mike might want to come in on that, but slightly kind of strange concepts. How do you define it? It's things that affect people's everyday lives, and the fact that they are not resolved by the organization to begin with. Yes, the problem has happened, the mistakes happened, but the fact that they don't fix it, that comes through. That can sometimes suggest that there are these bigger systemic issues there. So yeah, low stakes stuff, but high importance.
Great. I'm going to ask Sandra Beaton to come in now.
Yes, hello. I'm so glad you kicked off with the Ombudsman, looking at the Ombudsman, simply because I've been advocating for many years now for an Ombudsman for the police service. And I'm wondering, I mean, it's been a complete no-no, obviously, since I started on this Herculean task. But I'm just wondering if, in the light of learnings that you gained from this, whether you could possibly foresee it as even the remotest likelihood of happening, bearing in mind the high stakes that there are in this area.
Dónal, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I'll try and do it quickly because I suspect we could have a longer and very interesting conversation. So the Independent Office for Police Conduct was very nearly called the Police Ombudsman. The powers are slightly different, but to all intents and purposes, it has been set up as an ombudsman. Politicians didn't like the title and didn't want to put it there. You have got a police ombudsman in Northern Ireland, which is regularly in the news for various different reasons. So yeah, it's a really important area. It's really important that things are done thoroughly. The IOPC is not a member of the OA at the moment, and I think I'll leave it at that, and maybe we have a chat over a cup of tea another time.
Thank you. I'm looking at who else I've got hands up for, but also perhaps following on from that, we move to Nikos's questions, and I can see that that's been answered by Mike as well about the terms injustice and maladministration. If there isn't a legal definition of maladministration, can any of you speak to how it's interpreted by different ombudsman schemes, what the kind of the definitional work is within an ombudsman to address what it is that they're trying to get to the heart of as they investigate complaints?
So if I just make a start, I mean, I've responded that the legislation doesn't define what maladministration is. It's the term, and it is what we say it is essentially. So it's our discretion. We always have regards to maladministration and injustice together. Justice in the past, Crossman came up with various terms, including things like moral turpitude, which is the one that always sticks in my mind as a marvelously 1970s or thereabouts terminology. It was called the Crossman catalogue, various types of activity, types of failing, delay, bias, those sorts of things. But essentially, it is what we say it is. We have guidance on jurisdiction, which is published online, which sets out how we approach our investigations and which sets out the sort of factors we take into account. But essentially, it is a judgment call. And when I say we link maladministration and injustice in our heads when we're carrying out an investigation, that's very relevant because, we always have to consider the impact any fault might have had on the individual, and the two is, kind of iterative together. But essentially, yeah, it's frustrating, and it's not frustrating, it's just how it is. Maladministration is what we said is. It's not as crude as a hard defined test. Things that could be maladministration would be delay with impact, that would be a failure to respond, a failure to explain. But our focus is always, a bit like judicial review, our focus is always on, has the organisation carried out its decision making in the right way? If it has followed the right steps to make its decision, we can't question that decision. So we're not a court of appeal. We're not remaking decisions. We're looking at the process by which the decision making was carried out. So that's a real ramble through something that we spent several months training our staff in, so sorry for that. But if you dive into that, the thing that I've linked to there, I wrote, with the then Ombudsman several years ago and updated recently, and it's simply a very straightforward, very plain English articulation of what we expect in terms of how organisations make decisions. Administrative practice, we call it, which sounds very dull, but it's actually the crucial everyday kind of mechanics of how organisations make decisions, things like how they consult, how they engage, how they explain their decisions, etc.
Thank you. And Dónal?
Just very, very quickly, just to back up what Mike is saying, in some ways it's a very deliberate approach not to define maladministration, to keep it nice and broad, so you don't accidentally rule something out. But certainly in the past decade, across different ombudsman schemes, both public and private, there has been more a recognition of actually it would be helpful to set out what is good, and there has been this shift that Mike's describing to producing more kind of complaint standards and examples of what good actually looks like, to actually try and assist those organizations that are dealing with things.
The way I always sort of think of it is that sort of is a curious conundrum, but something can be unlawful but not maladministration, or something can be lawful but be maladministration. So a council could take a lawful decision but spend so long doing it and tell no one about it and not explain it. Therefore, it's a lawful decision, but it's maladministration. The other way around is really hard to think of. But if a council has made a decision that turns out to be unlawful, because the courts say it is, we can't say it's unlawful, it's not our role to. But it's gone about that decision in the right way. It's taken appropriate legal advice. It's just turned out in the long run, you know, the Supreme Court has ruled it's an unlawful decision. That doesn't make it maladministration.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe my last question area might be about the place lens that Han mentioned, the sort of geocoded data that exists with ombudsman schemes. And then we'll sort of bring this to a close just before 1. If anybody on the call wants to introduce themselves, I should have said that could be possible throughout in the chat. If you want to just give the speakers, an indication of who's been on the line, do just drop your details in the chat. But I was interested in this idea, and I wondered how interesting it was to ombudsman schemes themselves, about researchers who might be interested in particular parts of the country. I'm thinking within England, obviously, with the kind of strategic authorities that we have, the sort of greater sense of what the regional mayoral combined authorities have in their remit. And are you interested in finding out that or particular clusters of councils and have difficult problems? Is the kind of place lens interesting to the ombudsman in the way that it might also be interesting to academics? Is that something you could see? You know, you would say, well, we've got quite rich data on that, and we'd quite like that surfaced through working with academics.
Shall I kick off, Nicola?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, very interested. As an ombudsman scheme, we have been individual complaint led right from the outset. So what I mean by that is our systems don't necessarily lend themselves to geographical analysis. We have got better at that. You'll see on our website there's a map, a searchable map, where you can dive in and look at complaint data by geographical area, by which I mean council. But exactly as you rightly say, with the creation of strategic authorities, with creation of mayoral authorities, those are, by the way, within our jurisdiction. We can investigate complaints about them. We have started to attribute, in sort of data storage terms, complaints to mayoral geographies, so we can do data analysis on, you know, complaints as they impact on, you know, Greater Manchester Strategic Authority, etc. So we're kind of trying to think like that. When we were created, there were a number of different ombudsmen, and we have a much more geographical focus. So there were 3 ombudsmen at one time with a sort of north-south central focus. We had to abandon that in the interests of efficiency. But I would say it's an area of rich interest for us, but again, not a lot of capacity at the moment. We are trying at the moment, for example, this is kind of hot off the press, we're trying to look in a more intelligent way at where we're getting clusters of similar complaints in one geographical area, you know, that goes perhaps beyond a single council, to say, is there a problem in this particular service in this particular area, picking up on, so I can't remember the name, but some of the point that was made in chat about ICBs, for example, integrated care boards, and the larger geographies there. Is there something about the system that's going wrong in this place? So we would love to be able to dive into our data, or have people look at our data and cut and dice it in different ways. And we'd like to be able to start having intelligent conversations with, for example, the Mayor of Greater Manchester about, you know, common issues within their patch, but we don't have that capacity at the moment. So it's interest without ability at the moment, Nicola.
Thank you. Well, I want to just, there's a really interesting question from Ezra as one of the final ones here. I don't know if Ezra would like to come on screen about whether there maybe should be more of a unified consumer redress architecture, or whether sector specific is working. Ezra, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute. No, so that's fine. Put it in the chat because the connection isn't working for you. But maybe I'll just pass that over to Mike and Dónal as the final one. What about the complexity of navigating this for consumers, and what do you think about that one?
I'll let Dónal take that one.
Yeah, there was a report done by, I'm not sure any of the academics are on the call, but for Citizens Advice over 10 years ago, called Confusion, Gaps and Overlaps, describing the consumer landscape, and it still applies, sadly. So yes, I have to kind of put my hand up and say, look, our approach is we do think that there should be one ombudsman per sector. That's a really, really simple thing to say, because then you get into a conversation of, well, define a sector then. What do you think should be pulled in there? And our approach behind that is to try and make it easier for people to access. So I think you can make an explanation, a justification for if things are similar, or if people are going to be complaining that they'd have to go to two different organizations, well, wouldn't you want to pull that in? When does something get too big is another question as well. So I guess there's a little bit of a finger in the air of, sometimes you might say that there are, if you'd call it a subsector as such, that there is something kind of unique around that it would make sense to have a separate organization. But our general approach would not be that you just have one ombudsman that kind of rules everything, but you do take it to the highest kind of level possible. You know, there is a separate rail ombudsman. There isn't an ombudsman, for example, for buses or for other transport, or for aviation separately. We think there should be an ombudsman for aviation, but any government taking a logical step back approach to that might say, shouldn't there be some kind of transport ombudsman where you put things together? But the biggest issue, and you might say I would say this, wouldn't I? But the biggest issue lies outside the ombudsman sector. That's the problem. That's where the gaps and overlaps are, and that kind of complexity, multiple bodies, and the rest of it is where an ombudsman doesn't exist. And we think that should be brought in, so that whatever public service or private service that you engage with, that you should have access to an ombudsman. Great.
Mike, do you want a final word on this one?
I was just going to say one thing that Dónal's just reminded me of is one of I think in principle, coordination and simplification are absolutely key. One of the challenges would be if you bring things together. You remember that diversity that I talked about, everything from benefits to bins, etc. One of the problems would be a single PSO, public service ombudsman, for example. If you look at, a standard of approach of injustice, level of injustice, some of that diversity would fall away, because, we would be swamped. I mean, already we are fighting hard because we get so many adult social care, so many special educational needs, so many homelessness complaints. It's very difficult to justify investigating a really serious, significant issue in environmental health, for example, when you're facing that weight of challenges in areas that have very, very clear injustice. So yeah, as Dónal said, it's kind of slightly more complex than it appears.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Dónal, Mike and Han for their really insightful presentations today, and to you all for questions. So you are being invited, please, to complete a post-event survey. Please do sign up for UPEN's newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn. Look at our events page for forthcoming events. And I'll bring it to a close now at 1 o'clock, and hope that this leads to future research collaborations with this sector. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.